We're here to talk some Penn State football. As always, Max,
Yeah.
as always, Penn State's about halfway through, maybe a little over halfway through now. Spring camp, we were up there. Well, I was up there. You were already in town for Tuesday's spring practice. Talked to James Franklin. Talked to a few assistant coaches, some players, which we're going to be getting into after Penn State's seventh spring practice
That's right.
of camp. Of course, the 15th will be the blue-white game on April 26th. Max, a lot to talk about, a lot
Yeah.
to break down. We talked to Nick Singleton,
Mhm.
for the first time since after the Orange Bowl. A few months ago, Nick was at the podium after that loss and obviously emotionally spent and saying he didn't know kind of where what his future held. And then, of course, a few days later, he announced he was coming back for the 2025 season, along with Katron Allen, and Dennis Sutton, and a big group of that 2022 recruiting class, a foundational class. And Nick talked about why he decided to come back when he met with us on Tuesday night. We talked to Danny O'Brien, the quarterbacks coach. You were able to talk to some guys. Bob was able to talk to some people. Like, it was a really productive session.
Mhm.
Both being able to watch an extended piece of practice and talk to James Franklin and some other members of the program, Max. But first of all, how are you doing? How are you enjoying this Thursday, this magnificent Masters
Yeah.
Thursday?
Absolutely, Johnny. I know we'll sneak our Masters talk in. Absolutely. We always make sure to mention some golf on the podcast, but doing pretty well. I wish the weather wasn't so gross in Happy Valley. It's hard to call it Happy Valley in this time of year when it's still rainy and 30-40 degrees. But we're in good shape. Gonna be tuning in tonight to the Frozen Four, Penn State men's hockey. I had a couple stories up on Penn Live this week about their journey, incredible turnaround. I know we mentioned them last week, Johnny, before we kicked off the podcast. But yeah, they're in St. Louis. They're playing tonight, 8:30 p.m. Make sure if you missed the game, I'll have a recap for you. And curious, they've been underdogs the whole way, so it's hard to count them out again because this has been a heck of a run. But it's gonna be a tough one. But we're doing well, Johnny, and like you said, just a ton that's coming from this week in at spring camp because we got Danny O'Brien, we got Anthony Poindexter as well, and Phil Troutwine, and you spent time with O'Brien and Nick Singleton, so I think you're gonna probably carry this podcast for a little bit. But I had a lot of good stuff from Phil Troutwine as well, and then anything that we missed from Bob on Poindexter, gonna have to go over to Penn Live and check it out there.
Well, speaking of going out and checking stuff out at Penn Live, if you guys haven't read the Frozen Four stuff that Max has done, excellent work.
Appreciate it.
Previewing the game, not only the game tonight and their run, but really like the run of this program. From club hockey to now, it's been pretty remarkable what Guy Godowski, Terry Pagula with that investment and everything that program has been able to do in such a short span of time. So go check that out on PennLive.com if you haven't already. Max has it covered. But Max, all three of us, and Joe Herman as well, had
Mhm.
practice covered on Tuesday night. You mentioned Nick Singleton. I mentioned Nick Singleton at the top. It was great catching up with him. A lot has changed, over the last few months. He announces he's coming back after sitting down and going back and forth on a decision whether to enter the 2025 NFL draft or to come back for a senior season. The guy that recruited him, the guy that coached him, for 3 years, Jaywan Sider, leaves for Notre Dame. New running backs coach in Stan Drayton, who we've talked about his resume. It speaks for itself. The number of NFL players that he's coached and the number of teams that he's been on that has had a lot of success, national title success. And so Nick said he's learning a lot from him. But really, like, what I wanted to drill down on was his decision,
Mhm.
and why. Because he could have been, at pro day a couple weeks ago, working out in front of scouts. He could have been at the NFL Combine. He could have been vying to be one of the top running backs drafted in a couple weeks now, when the draft kicks off. And for him to come back, he said the biggest thing was he said that, look, everyone was upset with the way that the season ended. They weren't happy with how it ended, down there in Miami Gardens at Hard Rock Stadium in the CFP semifinals, coming up a few points short of beating Notre Dame and then ultimately playing Ohio State in the national title game. So that was a driving factor for him to come back, and the fact that, and he mentioned too, that, Zane Durant denied Dennis Sutton, Zaki Wheatley, and then a couple minutes after he announced that he was coming back, Katron Allen announced that he was coming back, and that wasn't that was planned. It's not like they were like, oh wow, look at us, announcing within 10 minutes of each other. They talked beforehand. Penn State fans remember that day, January 13th, was a pretty exciting one.
We were live on a podcast that day too, but Johnny.
We were. Hopefully, no huge news breaks right now.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was an eventful day, and a really important one, obviously, for Penn State's prospects this upcoming season. But Nick was great as always, and he's learning a lot of new things, which we'll get into. But obviously, he's a leader on this team, and a big reason why so many people have Penn State pegged as a national title contender, and some even have him as a preseason number one.
Yeah. It's I think that a lot of us can relate to that feeling of like, that post-game locker room after the game was tough, like, and that drives you to want to come back and do it again. And so, yeah, you see how many guys that have come back, and it's interesting to see Nick say it like flat out, be pretty honest about it. Like, I think Zane Durant was a little more careful around the topic when he said like, we had unfinished business. But for Nick to be, open and say like that hurt, like that, like we're coming back from that, I think that's interesting. And I mean, obviously, that's kind of what you expect from those guys, but it's still interesting. And you mentioned Stan Drayton too, because there were questions. Would Nick want to come back when Sider is gone? Like you said, guy recruited him, went to a school that, as you wrote about in the winter, Johnny, like Nick almost went to Notre Dame. Like that was there were definitely some question marks that if Nick was coming back to college, is it gonna be at Penn State? And it is. And I'm curious watching Stan Drayton in practice, because I think that obviously Jim Knowles got a lot of the attention this offseason because that was a massive move to be able to fill the defensive coordinator spot. But I've been really impressed with Stan Drayton in practice thus far. Just like I spent a lot of time watching his individual drills on Tuesday this week because you and I split the offense and the defense. And like the drills he's running are intense. And not only are they intense, but to steal a word from James Franklin on Tuesday, they're intentional. Like you can tell at every step of the drills that he's running, like, okay, this translates to this situation on the field. And like, don't get me wrong, we didn't see every ounce of practice while Sider was here, but I could definitely, like, in my opinion, it felt different. It felt a little more, intentional, from what we were able to see. And I think that his energy is really, really high. Like he expects a lot out of guys, I'm not trying to call out Corey Smith here, but it's just what we observed while we were at practice. He stumbled a couple times in a drill, and Drayton was like, he didn't let it slide. I mean, like, I was going to fall. He was throwing a pad at his feet. Like, I'm not like athletic enough to do that. A lot of people aren't, but he stops the drill and he's like, Corey, look, you got to stop falling. This is going to happen. You're going to cut through a hole and there's going to be a body there. You have to be able to get over this. And it was something simple. Like a lot of coaches might just brush off that a guy tripped over a pad, like at a split-second decision in a drill. But Stan Drayton wasn't having it, and I think that the way that he's been coaching these backs so far has been really intriguing. I think it's a good look for Nick Singleton and Katron, and I'm really curious to see how that continues to develop for them.
Yeah, and that's something that Nick acknowledged. He was asked, like, is it more intense, or how would you describe, how Stan Drayton is handling things this spring? And he acknowledged that it's a little bit more intense. He said that, that the way he described it was really interesting. He said, that he kind of works plays into the drills. And I guess that like example that you gave of Corey Smith, right? Like that's going to happen in a game, like those things. They're certainly not going through the motions, and not that they were under Sider, but, Drayton brings a fresh perspective into this, which, for younger guys like a Corey Smith or a Quentin Martin or even Tyke Hayes, like it's good that Drayton has the experience that he has, and he's just, a well-versed running backs coach. for a Nick Singleton and Katron Allen who are trying to up their game, like it could actually be, I think, a benefit to them
Yeah.
that they lost Sider and brought in Drayton. That going into their senior year, I think naturally your thinking would just be like, look, I know how this guy teaches, I know what drills we're going to be doing, I know all this stuff, and the fact that Drayton is coming in with that level of intensity, intentionality, like keeps you on your toes as a veteran. And
Yeah.
so Nick was talking about how that's going to help him, not only this season, but you look at his draft stock. Like, if he had left after this season, he wouldn't have been a first round pick. He would probably a day two guy, late second, maybe third. And it was a deep running back class too, because you got Ashton Genty from Boise State, who, is likely going in the top half of the first round. Omarion Hampton from North Carolina might go late in the first round. And you've got a bevy of backs who could go on day two. And so it's kind of a crowded room. Not that Nick couldn't stand out there,
Mm-hmm.
but, you look at the class, for next year, he has a real opportunity to establish himself as that top running back, not only in college football, but within the NFL draft circle and within that community when you're looking ahead to the 2026 NFL draft. Not that we're looking that far ahead because it's over a year away.
Right.
But when these guys are making their decisions, when Nick is sitting there with his family, days after, or maybe even a day or the night after the Orange Bowl and trying to decide what to ultimately do, that is the way that they're thinking, or at least a part of their thinking. He said money wasn't a part of the decision when it comes to NIL and future revenue sharing. Like, I think he's well compensated at Penn State, and he would have been if he left for the NFL, but that's not a massive concern or was really a factor in his decision. At least that's what he's told us. It was more about his development, and then above all else, that pursuit and that quest for a national championship and for finishing the job. As Zane Durant said, unfinished business, right? And that's how a lot of these guys are approaching this offseason.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the draft factor in this, because I believe Nick was getting second or third round grades on his way out of here for this season. And like, I have to imagine that the depth of this class played into it. I mean, especially in this NIL era where you can get paid well, by staying in college. Why not wait until you can be drafted a little bit higher for a running back needy team? I mean, not just the two guys you mentioned who are probably going in the first round, but like Caleb Johnson of Iowa, the two guys from Ohio State. Like, there are a ton of backs in this class. Devin Neal from Kansas. I know that's one who's standing out in the mid rounds. Like, there are a ton of really good backs who are going to catch on to NFL rosters this year. So it really just made a lot of sense for Nick to come back, I think. And yeah, with guys like Nick and Katron, who were both NFL caliber players to begin with, I think that having Drayton in the fold can only help them, because they have that baseline. If they learn one new thing from Drayton in this entire season, it can only be a boost to their stock. They're not going to completely change who they are as backs just because they have 1 year of a new running backs coach.
Yeah, it's about enhancing what they already do, just improving a little bit, right? And a couple of those improvements, at least what Nick was telling us, there's been a little bit more vision drills, a little bit more stiff arm drills, and like those things build up into turning a 13, 14, 15-yard run into a 50-yard run. And we know that Nick has the breakaway speed and the ability to break those runs. We've seen him do it over the last 3 seasons. But that's something that James Franklin talked about a lot too, is, as a running back, once you get to that second and third level, not just doing like some, move the chains in a chunk fashion, but like doing some serious damage and house calling it. And we know that Nick can do that. And Katron can rip off a big run or two as well. So that's something that I think, when you're thinking about how can Nick Singleton and Katron Allen improve, is maybe doing those things more consistently. And again, we're sitting here in April and the season starts in August. So like there's plenty of time they're going to run through countless drills in between now and then. But the work that's going on in spring camp right now, across the board, the entire team, but those little things are going to add up. Those little things are absolutely going to add up. And that's something that Danny O'Brien touched on. If we want to transition to the quarterback talk here, Max, like, we're talking to Danny O'Brien, Penn State's quarterbacks coach. about Drew Aller and about the quarterbacks. And he was saying that little gains can go a long way. And it's kind of coach speaky, I know, but like,
Yeah.
but it's true, especially now, right? When we're so far out from the season, and these guys, they don't need any added motivation coming into spring camp, given how last season ended and given the expectations and the hopes and goals of what's upcoming. But with Drew Aller specifically, it was interesting to talk to Danny O'Brien about, the last game, about the Notre Dame game. Danny was asked, about watching that film with Drew, and he said that they didn't sit down and watch, the interception late against Notre Dame. They didn't watch that full game film until a week or so after. He said he wanted to let the emotion die down. He wanted to let the noise die down a little bit. That way you could see it a little bit more clearly. And it seems like, Danny said that Drew took the film session well. He handled it like a pro. But he did mention that, just intentionally going through every throw, all the footwork, all like keeping it very, rigid and just kind of like, what is the breakdown here fundamentally, and learning from that and improving on that. I think it's just a big deal for Drew, as he tries to make those little gains into becoming an even better quarterback than he was last year.
Yeah, I mean, we've heard the answer now twice from James this offseason, but like they expect him to get better in kind of every facet of the game. But he's prefaced that by saying, well, he's already done that every year that he's been here. So we're not really asking much more from him. But like that end of the season was tough for him. And you got, being able to come back from that is going to be a big factor in what Penn State as a whole team can do this year. Like Drew Aller is, even though he is certainly probably a top 10 quarterback in the country next year, no matter how you slice it, like he is still probably the number one X factor for this team. Like if he can take yet another step, this team has a much higher ceiling because you can't have those throws at the end of the Orange Bowl. You just can't. You can't have what he did in the first half against Oregon in the Big Ten championship. Second half, he was great. He was throwing the ball all over the place and was really making some great throws. And like those are the things that he has to tap into more frequently. I mean, there's not a lot. Last season, they did a lot of work on his body to be able to get him in a position where, he was able to run more frequently like he did this year. And that's not going to be as much of an issue for him this year. I mean, obviously, they're still fine tuning things. We talked to Chuck Losey, I guess a month ago, 2 months ago at this point. But like, it's all about the decision making. It's about the footwork. It's about the things that they can do to avoid those disastrous plays like in the Orange Bowl, because that is really, if you ask me, that's the next step for Drew Aller. I think if you ask a lot of people, that's the next step for Drew Aller. But James Franklin says he's got to improve everywhere, including his leadership, which I know is probably a hot topic among the fan base, considering like the emotional displays from Aller, which I could get up on my soapbox about that. I have no issue with anything that he's done to this point. But people probably don't want to entertain that discussion. So,
Well, one thing you mentioned, Max, is when to take those shots and when to pull the trigger. And obviously the interception at the end of the Orange Bowl, that was not the time, right? Under a minute, tie game. You just can't make a mistake. Like
no.
so be it. If you get sacked, you go to overtime and you play it out from there. But one thing that Danny O'Brien was asked about was that balance, striking that balance. Because we saw Drew in his first year as a starter in 2023. The last year of Mike Yurcich being the offensive coordinator, he was more of that game manager, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, like he made some big throws, but they kind of like the deep ball wasn't there because they didn't really test it, downfield as much. Like he was just working within the framework of the offense. And it seemed like it was more an emphasis of limiting mistakes as opposed to, taking your shots. And, last year we saw under Andy Kotelnicki, which is one thing that can't be overlooked here, like second year with Andy as the offensive coordinator, I think is going to be huge for Drew and the entire offense. But, we saw those shots open up. Drew's Yards per attempt, yards per completion all went up. The interceptions went up. There was a few phenomenal throws in the Big Ten championship against Oregon. He also threw basically a pick six.
Yep.
The interception against Notre Dame, like those plays are glaring and they're magnified, especially when they're on the stages that they're on. But what Danny said was, basically, I'm trying to find the quote exactly here. Let's see. Oh geez, this is not good podcasting, Johnny. Okay. So he was talking about, the players, like they're human beings, failing on such a big stage and a big spotlight, like it's humbling, but it puts a chip on their shoulder going into the offseason in terms of, hey, we're that close. It's their little gains that'll get us over the hump. And that's like really true. And basically when you talk about Danny, the other part of this is that, O'Brien was talking about knowing when to play it safe and knowing when to be a quote unquote eraser. I found the quote. Thank you. God, that took way too long. He said, you can really only do that through playing though. And through playing a lot comes success and failure, which I think will be the biggest thing for him this coming year, knowing when to pick and choose those spots. And so like Drew knows it, Danny O'Brien knows it, James Franklin knows it. And when you go into the third year as a starting quarterback, you have a better feel, and to pull the trigger on those plays. And so, that was a long-winded way of me finally getting to the quote. I was looking through my story furiously. If you haven't read it already, I had a big story, just from what Danny O'Brien said and contextualizing everything better than I just did in that last minute.
Yeah.
But yeah, check that out if you haven't already.
No, I love the word eraser because I think it's kind of maybe an unintentional, but still like a double entendre in the way that like Drew has to be able to erase what happened in that Orange Bowl, but like he also needs to be able to erase like, and I might be reaching here, but like he needs to be able to erase poor play from wide receivers or a bad defensive possession. Like the arm talent that he possesses is so much greater than maybe anyone else in the country. Like we've talked extensively about why he's going to be one of the first quarterbacks off the board next year, if not the first in the NFL draft, regardless of how he plays this year. His arm talent is at that level where you start saying like he has to be able to throw guys open. He has to be able to take the big shots. So the decision making is part of it, and I think it's really interesting to hear that verbatim from Danny, where he says like, yeah, it's more about the timing of the shots and knowing when those are there, when's the right time to do it. Like that's all there. But I think the eraser word can be used. Like Drew has to be the reason Penn State wins games next year.
Yep.
And I think that's a word that I've used in the past. Like when Sean Clifford was still here, like when they played Ohio State, you'd say like, listen, this Penn State team is probably good enough to hang, but they got to have somebody win it for them. And it's got to happen at the quarterback position. You're going to say that a lot this year too, especially for a team that wants to win a national championship. Drew Aller has to be the reason Penn State wins games. He has to be able to cover for mistakes or lacking play at other parts of the roster. To this point in his career, he hasn't been.
Yeah, and you take away Tyler Warren from the offense because you could argue he was the eraser,
right?
For Penn State last year. It's like, okay, nothing, we're stalling out a little bit. Like receivers aren't creating separation on the outside. Tyler Warren's open. He is always. Right. It's like AJ Brown where he's like, I'm open. I'm always open. Tyler Warren was always open, and he's going to be always open for an NFL team soon enough. But he leaves, and we know that the wide receiver room is in reset mode. You've got the stabilizing factors of Nick Singleton, Katron Allen, and most of a returning starting offensive line. So you have that foundation and base in place. But like you mentioned, Max, like, they've got Oregon on the schedule next, this upcoming season, Ohio State. And this is a team that expects to be back in the Big Ten title game, that expects to not only be back in the CFP, but to be back in the semifinals, to be, elevating to a national title game appearance. And funny enough, Max, next year's national title game, you know where it's at?
I actually don't.
Hard Rock Stadium in Miami.
Oh, I did know that. I did know that. Yeah, I can just see it now. If they do get there, I think 78% of the Penn State Beats story lead is going to say the last time Drew Aller was here, he blah 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 blah.
Yep. That's why as my closer to the story I wrote earlier in this week, I used it then.
Okay.
So if any of our colleagues on the Penn State beat happen to take a look at that, they're filing that one away in the memory bank.
I was going to say you beat him to it, Johnny. You're ahead of the game.
Yeah, it definitely won't be used again. Yeah, I definitely won't go back to that well.
Yeah.
But, it is one of those things where, there is these expectations on this team, and that falls on the shoulders of the quarterback. Like James Franklin says it all the time that, when I asked him last week about Trace McSorley being a part of this coaching staff, and Trace, who's the assistant quarterbacks coach now, James went into a little bit of a, as he's talking about Trace and his experience, he said something that he said time and time again, that, playing quarterback at Penn State and being the head coach at Penn State, like you're in two of the biggest positions, in terms of the fan base. Like, when things go well, it's great, right? When things don't go well, it's your fault.
Mm-hmm.
And Trace knew that, because he was in that position,
Yep.
and Drew knows that. Drew knows that better than me, 99% of the people who weren't Penn State quarterbacks, starting Penn State quarterbacks. So, he understands that the responsibility is there, the pressure is there, and he's got to step up and perform. And again, what Danny O'Brien is focusing on right now is making those little gains, just continuing to grow and develop, whether that's in the film room, breaking down the interception that ended Penn State's season last year, or that's breaking down practice number 7. He said the play is the play, and to really focus on that as we barrel towards the end of spring camp and then ultimately summer camp and the season.
Yeah. You hit on something, Johnny, that I want to wrap us up with here. The offensive line coming back. We mentioned at the top, I spoke with Phil Troutwine for quite a bit. I appreciated the insight we got from him, because I think that for reasons that are much different than they were in the past, the offensive line is a really interesting group this year, because you mentioned they have 4 of 5 returning starters. They only lost Sal Wormley from the right guard spot. They get everyone else back and then some. I mean, they're in a position that not many teams are in these days in the transfer portal era, where they had a key depth guy come back for a final season in JB Nelson. They added a guy who could add some depth in TJ Shanahan from Texas A&M. I mean, he's still a bit of a raw prospect that, he's probably not going to be the first guy out of the rotation, but he played at Texas A&M. Like he has experience at the highest level. This is a really rare situation. Oh, and another name that I forgot to mention in that group is the first spot that I want to hit on is right tackle. They bring back 2 guys that started 10 in 6 games, in Anthony Donko and Nolan Rucci. Anthony Donko burst onto the scene after his Peach Bowl appearance for Caden Wallace. He didn't start. He played pretty much the entire game, though, at least all of the second half. And then he started all of last year before he got hurt and was playing well. And Nolan Rucci started the season after transferring Wisconsin and was not playing well. Like, he did not play well in relief of Anthony Donko. But once he became the starting right tackle, he might have been the best player on that offensive line through the playoff run. He was really good.
I think I always take Pro Football Focus with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
When they're grading, like I think it's a good resource for, and this isn't like a referendum on PFF, but
right.
I use them for snap counts and a lot of other things. But they rated Nolan Rucci as the highest graded offensive lineman in the CFP.
Yeah.
And the he was on the right side of that line.
Yeah. Nolan was really good. And so Penn State enters this season with 3 guys who were not starters last year that, probably could be starters. And that's not even to mention Cooper Cousins, who is probably, the preseason favorite to win that other guard spot to replace Sal Wormley. So this offensive line is in a situation where it was really good last year, one of the best rushing attack offensive lines. They fit what Andy Kotelnicki wants to do really well with the athleticism up front, the ability to run the wide zone and get everything rolling. They weren't perfect in pass protection, but they still were, upper echelon of college football, and they're all coming back. So I think, Phil Trautwein, how are you going to handle this? Because there are a lot of mouths to feed and, only X number of snaps to go around. So to start with right tackle, it's a little coach speaky to say it's going to be a true competition. Those guys are going to have to fight for it. But I really did believe him when he said it. Like he said it with conviction, and it extends beyond Anthony Donko and Nolan Rucci, because both of those guys are out of spring practice right now. And as I wrote about last week, and I included in a story today about the right tackle spot, Javen Williams has played right tackle right now, and he's kind of hitting that, Johnny, we've talked about him, he's kind of hitting that stride in spring for a younger mid-year player where something just clicks. And Javen Williams has played really well in spring so far. He's gotten his pass pro together after never throwing the football while missing, and he could be in the conversation at right tackle. Trautwein went out of his way to say Egan Boyer, who's a second year, is in the conversation. He traveled as a freshman last year. I'm certainly not going to predict him to be the starting right tackle or to even see more than maybe 50 snaps in garbage time next year. But he's in the conversation. Phil Trautwein said his name. He was asked about Garrett Sexton, the other second-year tackle, and he immediate was like, Garrett's playing his best ball right now. I should have included him in the right tackle conversation. So there are 5 names that could legitimately see time at right tackle next year. And I don't think that that's hyperbole. If I had to make a prediction, I'm probably going with Anthony Donko as the starter. But then you're going to see Nolan Rucci. You're probably going to see Javen Williams too. And who knows from there. But there are 5 names that could take that spot.
Yeah, and it could be even Williams even coming in as a swing tackle because he's worked at both spots in practice over the last couple of years. And just emphasize too when we talk about the offensive line, the Brown line has always brought, that James Franklin has always brought up, but the season is longer now than it ever had been before. Mm-hmm. And look at last year, right? Penn State had 16 games they played in. Mm-hmm. They could have been 17. They hope it's 17 this upcoming season. Mm-hmm. And that takes a toll. That takes a toll on everyone. If you're running back, like we saw Nick Singleton get, banged up last year, we've seen guys get banged up. But the offensive line in the trenches, start 17 games, or you need a breather, mm-hmm. and getting some rest, in every third series, whatever it may be, especially in the opening few games where Penn State's going to be expected to win very comfortably against FIU. Those offensive linemen are going to have to play and pretty decent. So very intrigued to see how this all shakes out. Very, very intrigued.
Yeah. And last year you mentioned it, and it's something Phil Trautwein said too. I can keep guys healthy because we have depth. And that is not a reality Penn State had 3 years ago. He can keep guys healthy. They expect a long season. Last year, 8 guys played at least 100 snaps on the offensive line. That's significant. You have your 5 starters, then you have 3 guys who rotated in some capacity in a big way. So you can anticipate seeing at least 8 guys do it again this year. That's always I think that's always a good baseline number. So there are going to be names that appear that are beyond what you're expecting. To hit on the guard spot a little bit, I do think it comes down to Cooper Cousins and JB Nelson right now. JB Nelson was their super utility guy last year. He can play tackle if he needs to, probably better suited at guard. Started at guard 2 years ago, and we thought maybe he was going to be a big name to watch moving forward. Maybe he took a step back last year, but was also just blocked up by 2 really good guards in front of him with the emergence of Vanga Ioane. And so we're in a situation where I think JB Nelson is probably the incumbent right now, if you want to say it that way, because he's got a little more experience. But Cooper Cousins played a lot last year too. And I asked Phil Trautwein about Cooper Cousins, and he said it's just about consistency. It's about his hands right now. We're just looking for him to get a little bit smoother in his punch And there's just little technicalities that a second-year offensive lineman has to learn to be able to do it full time. But I think you're probably going to see a lot of both of those guys. And the other key is I think you're going to see him at left guard more than you are at right guard, which might be a little bit of a surprise because Sal Wormley is the guy who left and was playing that right guard position. But Venga Ioane made mention last week when we talked to him that he was playing a lot of right guard this spring. Phil Troutwine was asked about it too. He said for now it's just because he wants to make sure guys can play at both spots, but we'll certainly see come blue-white time, whether that's a permanent thing for Venga Ioane or if that's really just temporary. But I think it's really interesting. TJ Shanahan, who we mentioned, is going to be a swing guy across the interior. He can play both guard spots and center. He's probably going to be that, third string option at every spot. But this offensive line is as deep as it gets. And I don't think it's a stretch to say it's going to be top 5 at least in the nation next year.
Yeah, compare that to like years ago. When James and line didn't have enough bodies at a real spring game because of the limitations and everything else. And I know it's a long time, and you expect them to build it back up, but just I don't know. I think it just kind of goes under the radar, the job that Phil Troutwine has done over the last few years specifically in building up this offensive line from not only a top-tier performance standpoint with the starters, but from a depth standpoint and what they have in the 2 deep. And so that's something to watch for. As we wrap up spring ball and look towards the blue-white game, we've got another set of availability next week, practice and talking to some coaches the following week as well. So very much looking forward to that, Max. One quick note I want to throw in here at the end as we wrap up. We were talking about Drew Aller, quarterbacks earlier. Quick note on who might be Drew's backup.
Yeah.
We're going to have to wait. We're going to have to wait. It's either going to be Ethan Grunkemeyer or Jackson Smolik. Grunkemeyer was the team's number 2 quarterback in the CFP last year after Bo Perbula entered the transfer portal and ultimately ended up at Missouri. Jackson Smolik, missed the entire season, with an injury that was suffered, around this time last year, a long-term injury that he's back from and he's battling in camp. James Franklin said that he expected Jackson to be a little rusty coming off the injury, and not been the case. James also said that it's not coach speak to say that they're both doing very, very well. But it's a good sign. Jackson's out there. It's a good sign that it's going to be a competition. They're going to, I wouldn't be surprised if this drags out into training camp in August. And look, I get it. Like, why would Franklin say anything over who has a lead or name a backup like right now, especially when the spring transfer portal is opening up here next week?
Yeah.
The silliest thing to do would be like, oh yeah, Ethan Grunkemeyer is our backup, and then Smolik's like, okay, well I'm the 3, I'm going to leave, or vice versa. You're not going to say that. Danny O'Brien said both guys are working their butts off and are both impressing him as well. So that's something that we're probably going to have to wait on, but still a lot of good commentary from Danny on the backup quarterback position. That I'll have a story coming out on Friday morning on that. So you might be listening to this on Friday. If you are, go on Penn Live and check it out.
There we go. Yeah, both guys. Ethan Grunkemeyer, we would probably say has the higher ceiling based on his prospect pedigree, but both guys have received praise from Penn State coaches in the past, and have the potential for bright futures here in Happy Valley. So, good note to wrap up on. But Johnny, I have to ask you, who's winning the Masters?
Well, we're recording it right now. It's 12:44 p.m. on Thursday, and Scotty Scheffler has already looked like Scotty Scheffler.
Yeah.
So it's tough to pick anyone else. Like my guy before the tournament started was Colin Morikawa.
Okay.
And I think he's about 1 under right now. I don't know where he's going to end up. He started off a little rough. I mean, he was even par through 6-7 holes, as you can tell, following it very closely.
Yeah.
It's always one of my favorite weekends of the year. But Colin was my pick. I also like Shane Lowry a lot too as
All
a
right.
risky little play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't, for as much as I love golfing, I actually don't follow the professional scene very closely. Love the Masters. Will absolutely be tuning in on Sunday at the very least, but I'm gonna have to refrain from making a prediction for myself.
All right. So I said Shane Lowry. One other guy I want to throw in, and I'm not just throwing like 5 names at you, but a guy to watch would be Russell Henley.
Okay.
Winning in Florida in the Florida swing, and his ball striking is great. I like Russell Henley a lot this weekend.
All right. You heard it here first. Johnny made 5 predictions on somebody who can only win the Masters by himself. So maybe we got a 5-way playoff coming. We have a 12-team playoff in college football, so maybe they'll figure out a way to do that at the Masters too. But something tells me it won't happen.
I think Scotty's going to win, but like I just hope it's like, and I don't dislike Scotty at all, but I mean like the guys won 2 of the last 3. Like
Yeah,
give
he's
someone else a
dominant.
chance.
He's dominant. Yeah. He's dominant. Appreciate y'all tuning in. As a reminder, every Thursday we go live on the Blue White Breakdown. Johnny McGonigal, Max Ralph, signing off. Spring ball about halfway done. Take care.